No, your eyes are actually not lying. And no, this is not a doctored up image. You're actually seeing a radically modified 1957 Mercury driven by Bill Stroppe in the same corner as a Ferrari 250 Testarossa driven by the legendary Pedro Rodriguez circa 1959. As you well know by now, the photo in and of itself isn't the story. It's how the moment of these two cars existing together in this image came to pass that's the story. The Big Mercury is the centerpiece of this exploration, and it was called the Mercury Mermaid. By the time this image was made, the car was years old and had served its original purpose on the sands of Daytona Beach, so what was this all about? That is going to take some explaining. So let's get to it. Rather than go through some horrendously boring history of the Mercury brand of cars that, of course, lived under the Ford umbrella, let's just say that it was an upscale brand for that many years had kind of fallen into the polished-up Ford category. It was a brand for people on the rise. Someone who aspired to own a Lincoln, but wasn't quite financially there yet. And frankly, that's where it was positioned from its introduction in the late 1930s to its reemergence after World War II. Nice cars, nice ride, nice image. They were not racers. Well, not on purpose anyway, and we have more on that in a second. Bill Stroppe grew up as a mechanically curious kid, fiddling with a family truck as a 10-year-old and working as a dismantler of cars at a junkyard shortly thereafter. He was into anything with moving parts, and the faster it went, the better it was. He went to a technical high school, one where he basically lived in the auto shop, and that auto shop was run by a guy with a race car. Recognizing the passion and brilliance in the young man's mind, his teacher would bring him along to the races, and it wasn't long before Stroppe was trying to build his own racing machines, jalopies of course, back in the day. It was during the same time period that Stroppe met an amazingly gifted hot rodder and engine builder named Clay Smith. Yes, the Clay Smith of Clay Smith Cams, Mr. Horsepower, and all of it. The two became fast friends in the most literal of ways. After high school, Stroppe took a job as a dealership mechanic, and during that he was fiddling with race cars and other projects. He actually bought a wooden-hulled hydroplane racing boat, and Clay Smith built him an engine for it, which happened to be a hot-rodded version of a Ford Flathead Inline 6. Now, the dealer that Stroppe worked for was named Art Hall, and he funded these two guys, both Stroppe and Smith, to take this boat to Detroit to compete in the Henry Ford Memorial Regatta, which was the biggest, most throwdown boat race in the country at this point. And as fate would have it, the perfect place for both Bill Stroppe and Clay Smith to make a massive impression on the world. Benson Ford Jr., of course, one of the descendants of Henry Ford, was on hand to watch the race, and the dealer Hall had called for it and let him know that he had these two guys out there, and they were people that they had to watch. As it turns out, they had brought more than enough in terms of that little boat and little engine, because they killed them all. Not only dominating their own class of racing, but also performing into the upper echelons of even bigger engine, better designed, seemingly boats. The biggest shock came from the Ford engineers. See, internally at Ford, the Flathead Inline 6 was kind of a hated engine. It would start to vibrate and wouldn't want to rev past 4,500 RPM, and despite what engineers have been trying, nothing was working. But this boat, it spun way past that. As it turns out, the trick was in Smith's engine work and the custom grind camshaft that brought the engine through such an area of vibration very quickly where it could spin up to higher RPM and smooth out. As it turned out, their lower-class boat was running in the ballpark of the full-bore, basically unlimited hydroplanes that weekend with this unloved engine and an old hull. Offered jobs almost instantly on the spot with Ford, Smith and Stroppe pitched them an idea of a West Coast special project shop. They could do race car work, custom projects, testing, development work. You name it, they could handle it. And believe it or not, Ford bit. The men were not only just friends now, they were business partners, and business was good. We jump now from 1947 to 1950. Far from the boat race, Art Hall, the same guy that had sent them to Detroit, pitched the guys on the idea of preparing a car and driving it in the mobile gas economy run. Now, this sounds kind of lame by today's standards, but this was a very high-profile event. It was an event that had as big a profile as really any race in the country, and many car companies were obsessed with the mobile gas economy run. Faring badly at the event did not help your brand and actually harmed sales, but winning the sucker was enough to build a national advertising campaign around. So while Detroit chewed their nails, Bill Stroppe won it. The first of two times he would do it in 1950, some say 51, Some say 52, but either way, Bill Stroppe twice, in cars he built himself, won the Mobile Gas Economy Run. Now something else happened in 1950. Bill Stroppe talked to a Lincoln dealer, and he talked that dealer out of a car and grabbed a stock car race named Johnny Mance. The two of them headed to Mexico and nearly won the first Carrera Panamericana Mexican road race. Going back down again in 1951, Troy Ruttman and Clay Smith nearly won the event in a Mercury they had bought for next to nothing off of a used car lot. Competing against some of the finest drivers and cars in the world, that story, the story of the used Mercury that almost won the Panamericana race, perhaps deserves a video all in and unto itself. Now, in early 1952, Stroppe and Smith, who were two of the brightest shining stars in the Ford universe, were invited to work on the pit crew of Troy Ruttman at the Indy 500, who would have Ford backing at the race. Of course, Ruttman won the Indy 500 in 1952. After he won, in the afterglow of the event, Smith and Stroppe told Benson Ford that with some minimal investment, Lincoln cars could dominate the Carrera. The rules had changed. There was now a sports car class and a stock car class. Now, with a less than ideal preparation schedule, 3 Lincolns were made ready, shipped to Mexico, and they promptly swept the podium, running 1, 2, and 3 in the stock car category. During their domination, our heroes had noticed a lot more Mercurys competing, likely inspired by the heroic tales of Smith and Ruttman the year before. For 1953, it was more of the same but better. The race had continued to grow in international stature, so Ford was focused on keeping Lincoln on top of the heap. With a full year to prepare, they decimated the competition in 1953, once again sweeping the stock car podium. In 1954, the good news was that Lincoln won again. The bad news was that 7 more people had been killed among the scores that had died in the years before, and organizers canceled the event. Worse than that, months before the event, Clay Smith had been killed in a freak accident when a car launched into the pits of a circle track he was at in Illinois. Stroppe, who was staggered and dazed by the very heavy emotional blows, staggered forward with the help of the Lincoln Mercury brand as well as his own racing successes. Stroppe loved to drive just as much as he loved to manage projects and create race cars. His personal race car was a Curtis Craft chassis with a full-bore Clay Smith flathead V8 in it, and during the early 50s, he won an absolute slew of sports car races in California. This was a guy who ate, slept, breathed, thought, and excreted automotive competition excellence like few have before and few have since. In 1955, Stroppe hired his old friend and trusted driver Johnny Mance for a 1955 stock car campaign that was quietly backed by Mercury. In 1956, he hit the national stock car trail in both NASCAR and USAC with Billy Myers as his primary driver. For Mercury, he had also built a custom stock car for the Daytona Speed trials that preceded the race. That car, tricked up as it was using all the rules and all the accumulated experience of Stroppe's life, destroyed the competition and records for the various distances it competed at. 1957, though. 1957 is the year when things get good. The Mercury brand was lagging in sales through the middle 50s, so Ford decided on a pretty radical departure. Mercury would get their own bodies, separate from Ford, with longer wheelbases, different styling, and more brand differentiation. In order to celebrate all of this, there was one thing that Mercury really needed to do, and that was to go racing, and to do it seriously. Stroppe got the call, not just for building and preparing stock cars capable of winning on short tracks and high-banked ovals, not just to build a special 1957 Mercury to attempt speed records on the Daytona sands, but also to develop a gnarly factory engine package that could be obligated to meet NASCAR's production rules. Back in 1955, Mercury had split with Lincoln again in an attempt to give the brand some more leg to stand on and self-identity. And in 1957, they got a version of the beefy Lincoln 368 cubic inch V8 to use in their production models, mainly in the Turnpike Cruiser. This version of the factory engine in the Turnpike Cruiser was rated at 290 horsepower, but for stock car racing, they needed way more. And beyond that, they needed a high-performance street package that could sell at least 100 examples to prove to NASCAR that the engine and package were available to the general public. So, Stroppe to the rescue. As he had been all but thrown the keys to this whole operation, he called the shots. For the 100 road-going versions, he spec'd the better Lincoln blocks and specified the engines would have 10-to-1 compression ratio. The race versions had 10.8-to-1. The engines were totally blueprinted. A special dual-quad intake manifold was developed for a pair of 4-barrel carburetors, An Isky mechanical roller cam was installed with 286 degrees of duration and 486 lift on the intake and exhaust side. Add in heavy-duty valve train parts and other tweaks, and you have a pretty stout anvil of an iron engine. Called the M335, every engine was guaranteed to have made at least that much horsepower on Stroppe's dyno before being shipped. With more compression, more camshaft, and likely more tuning, the race-spec engines were said to be in the 400 horsepower neighborhood at full song. These images from inside Stroppe's shop in 1957 show the M335 engines being assembled, a couple with the intake manifolds on, and many more getting ready for the conversion. Now, the engines could be bought over the counter as a dealer item, but most of the 100 built were actually put into that run of production cars. And those cars were very interesting, called the Monterey M355 Specials. The front ends were constructed with heavy-duty parts from Lincolns and station wagons and police cars, again using parts that Stroppe had helped develop. The rear ends were filled with truck parts and used the brand-new 9-inch legendary Ford axle housing with 389 gears. The transmission, a Borg-Warner T85 3-speed stick, was modified in the Stroppe shop and was attached to an aluminum bell housing, a heavy-duty clutch, and a 35-pound flywheel. Now, occasionally, if you're an eagle-eyed hunter, you can find the M335 intake manifolds on eBay, and you can figure paying about $5,000 for one of those today. They're incredibly rare, incredibly coveted, and incredibly expensive. If you happen to get your hands on one and there's a number stamped into the front of it, that manifold actually belonged to an engine assigned to be installed into a car and was not simply sold as an individual part. Those that have no stamping were simply sold over the counter at dealerships to hot rodders who wanted to make their Mercurys faster on the street. So now that we know all this, we can move to the beast that is at the center of this story. The machine built not to race wheel to wheel against others on the sands of Daytona, but to charge down those sands as fast as possible and set a speed record to claim glory for the Mercury brand. It was called, weirdly enough, the Mermaid, and it was Bill Stroppe at his finest. After constructing multiple legal stock cars, the Mercury brass cut Stroppe and his imagination loose on what to do for a 1957 kind of finale build even before the NASCAR season started. He looked at a 1957 Mercury Monterey and saw something no one else on the planet did. He thought that the big brick of a car may actually look good and perform better as a roadster, and so the process began. As many of you know, NASCAR Speed Weeks in the 1950s were built around a myriad of different events leading up to the Daytona Beach course event before the Speedway was constructed. There was drag racing, and more importantly, there were speed trials held on the Daytona Beach sands itself. Different classes broke out stock cars from sports cars, and there was an experimental class which was basically wide open for anybody to try virtually anything. Stroppe and his talented crew of wrenchmen, namely Art and Lloyd Chrisman, the famed hot rodders and drag racers, wanted to chase that category. They started with a 1957 Mercury Monterey convertible and stripped the windshield, top, frame, and all the associated convertible stuff out of it. They sent the car to the famous IndyCar builder Eddie Kuzma to have a really nice one-piece aluminum tonneau made to fill what was now a massive gaping hole where the roof and associated stuff should have been. A master metalworker nearly beyond compare, Kuzma's work is flawless. It looks as though this car left the factory with its top sealed completely off, and nothing looks out of place, except maybe that giant wing, fin thing in the back. They did have Kuzma add the rear stabilizer wing and a headrest that became a signature part of the car, and as it was kind of a fin shape, it may have led the car to being called the Mermaid. Either that or the fact it was about to be the most beautiful thing on the beach, at least in the eyes of the guys at Stroppe's shop in Long Beach, California. Of course, the idea here was that removing the roof and the windshield not only took weight off the car, but also was a massive reduction in what the Mercury had to shove through the air to gather and achieve top speed on the sand. Shoving it over that sand would be a pretty healthy engine. Starting with a 1957 Lincoln 368, Stroppe took it out 125 thousandths per cylinder, resulting in a displacement of right around 390 cubic inches after that significant bore job. Knowing what he knew about the M335 program, he ramped it all up a bunch. The compression ratio was cranked, a scintilla magneto was used, Hilborn fuel injection, a Harman & Collins roller camshaft, and custom-made Hedman headers were employed. The engine was dyno-tuned, worked over, and made well north of 400 horsepower, especially when nitro was added to the mix. The rules in the experimental class were open as far as fuel went, and these guys are going to take advantage of being able to use the good stuff. On the suspension front, the car was basically set up like the stock cars. Had the same lower stance, heavy-duty suspension, police package or severe-duty parts, and other tidbits like beefy hubs and the stuff the machines designed to tackle the actual race used. In short, we're guessing these guys figured they would have it in the bag in terms of the killer engine, the factory backing, the aero improvements, and their collective brain power. Now, there was one thing that these guys didn't quite figure on, though. That being said, the hot rodder racer circles they ran around in California may have allowed them to catch wind of something, and that something was Wally Parks. More specifically, it was Wally Parks, a Plymouth Savoy, and a full-race Hemi. Wally Parks, then the editor of Hot Rod Magazine, the founder of the National Hot Rod Association, his editor Ray Brock, and an engine builder named Bill Likes had gotten together on a last-minute thrash to build a car to compete in the same experimental class that Stroppe and the boys were headed for. Now, their plan of attack was different. They talked to the local and then regional Plymouth managers and were able to finagle a 1957 Savoy out of the fleet. Upon getting the car, about 2 weeks remaining before the event, they burned up the phones looking for an engine, and they found one. The engine came from Harry Duncan, was built at Wilcap Automotive by Tony Capana, and was used in the dragster of Ed Losinski. Now, this Hemi, injected, made about 450 horsepower on straight methanol. It was a 392-based engine that had enlarged displacement, and with nitro, it was going to be even more powerful than that. Now, the guys made a belly pan for the car, massive aluminum covers for the headlights, and they added taller Firestone Bonneville tires, as well as a 292 gear ratio in the rear end. Whether Stroppe and the boys knew about it or not, this car was going to be a major threat, and the engine in it definitely was hairy-chested, making enough power to potentially push its huge sides and big fins through the air at a faster speed than the Mercury. The Mercury would definitely be more aerodynamic, but if this came down to a horsepower contest, the Hot Rod boys may be in control. Now, the guys from Hot Rod hauled the thing down there not on a trailer truck like Stroppe stuff, but rather behind Ray Brock's 1954 Oldsmobile on a tow bar all the way from California. And then there was a plot twist. Whether or not these guys knew about each other is up to debate, but one thing they did know is that they were both informed of a last-minute rule change to the competition. Gasoline would be the only fuel allowed in the experimental class. No nitro for the Hemi, and none for the Lincoln engine either. With both cars making the trip to Florida now on the sand, Parks and the Hot Rod Special landed the first blow. His opening salvo was a roaring charge of 153.453 miles per hour into the wind. On his return run with a breeze at his back, Parks hammered the massive Plymouth to a terminal speed of 166.898 miles an hour. This was the fastest speed for a stock body car in the history of Daytona, and enough to make an average of 159.893 miles per hour. The whole car had been smashed together in about 2 weeks, most of the parts borrowed, and Brock claimed the total expenditure of about $400 when all was said and done. Now, clearly this was to make people know that when the Mercury boys blew them out of the water, at least they had done their car on the cheap. After some days of struggle, Art Chrisman was finally on a good rip. The roofless Mercury, its small-formed windscreen deflecting sand and air, stomped and snorted to a terminal speed of 159 miles per hour. Unfortunately, the run back into the wind would be slower. The car would average 154.176, which was well behind the Plymouth. Stroppe and the Chrismans went to work and put the most ragged-edge tune-up they could dream into the car. Chrisman set off again a day or two later, and this time he reported seeing a tach reading in high gear that would indicate 180 miles per hour. This came moments before a radiator hose decided it was no longer man enough for the job, sent the contents of the cooling system everywhere, caused engine damage, and ended the speed trials for the Mercury Mermaid. The coolant wasn't the only splash this car made, though. The public loved it. The machine was profiled on the cover of Hot Rod Magazine and widely covered through magazines across the automotive realm. Unlike the Hot Rod Plymouth that eventually went to Bonneville, the Mercury went back to Stroppe's shop to live a quiet life, or so it thought. This story is by no means over, although it may seem like it, because months later Mercury would then sign on to the infamous racing ban that American car companies came up with. Stroppe was suddenly in a position where racing wasn't the primary focus of his business. He still worked as a special projects garage for Mercury, continuing with severe duty parts development and other interesting work, but racers want to race, and that's where the neatest part of the Mercury Mermaid story comes into play. Feeling the kind of itch only a racer can feel, and looking across his shop, seeing the hulking mermaid sitting there, Stroppe must have developed a wry grin as he filed his paperwork to enter the 1959 Kiwanis Grand Prix at Riverside International Raceway. Yes, this former speed record chaser from Daytona was about to go road racing, and it was about to do it against some of the best cars and drivers in the world. The entry list for this race was amazing. Richie Ginther, Ken Miles, Bob Holbert, Pedro and Ricardo Rodriguez, Chuck Day, Lloyd Ruby, Bob Bondurant, Ack Miller, and on and on and on. A load of killer Ferraris, Porsches, Jags, Maseratis, Lotus entries, Aston Martins, and yes, a Mercury Roadster. 37 cars qualified for the race, and a large by huge Mercury landed in the number 29 spot with Bill Stroppe at the wheel. No doubt Stroppe was having the time of his life wheeling this barge around the racetrack. The race itself was a 46-lap affair around the 3.275-mile Riverside course, and it was held on July 15, 1959. By all accounts, Stroppe and the huge Mercury actually made some forward progress through the field after the green flag and accounted for itself better than people initially imagined it would. Ultimately, though, after 31 laps, the tank-like racer would retire with undisclosed mechanical issues, garnering an official DNF in the history books. It was the last time the car would see any action. Through the early 60s, Stroppe took on many different projects with many different companies, even, gasp, Chevrolet. Eventually, he took on racing projects for Autolite spark plugs, and when the guy running that division was put in charge of a true Mercury racing effort in 1962, the first call that Fran Hernandez made was to Bill Stroppe, and the preparations for the 1963 Marauder that would dominate stock car racing were set into place. Stroppe's genius carried through NASCAR, Pikes Peak, the GT40 program, and various other projects, but perhaps most legendarily in off-road racing. This is where he created the Big Ole Bronco, changed the course of history, and truly immortalized himself as one of the great racing men of the 20th century. The story of the Mermaid is a great one, and it's often kind of short-souled as well. Unless you know all the stuff around it, like the M335 program, the evolution of Stroppe with guys like Clay Smith, the slow and kind of painful entrance of Mercury into racing, and perhaps the unexpected competition from Wally Parks and Hot Rod Magazine, as well as capping the whole thing off with its awesome swan song as a road racing brawler, all you have is kind of an interesting-looking 57 Mercury that went pretty fast. And obviously, it's way more than that. The original Mermaid was parted out and has been effectively vanished for more than 50 years now, but fear not. A very faithful and awesome, seemingly nut-and-bolt perfect recreation has been made by a man named Royce Blechler. The car does seem to get out to a fair amount of events and car shows, and if you get a chance to look at it, you will be seeing a near pitch-perfect recreation of the original. Now, while it may not have had the sleek and lithe lines of the Mermaid sailors have sung on for centuries, the Mercury Mermaid had other qualities mermaids are supposed to possess. It was fast, it was fleeting, and for the most part, it can only be spoken of as a piece of mythology in the colorful racing past of America. I'm Brian Loans. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more automotive history, racing history, and machines from the past which deserve to be remembered and celebrated. See you next time.